Hello, in this video we're going to continue with some practice on understanding how the government can respond to shocks in the economy. So let's consider an economy where the unemployment rate is at 20% and the inflation rate is at 2%. What policies can the government enact to help this economy? Well, let's observe what's happening here. With an unemployment rate of 20%, what this shows us is that this unemployment is greater than the unemployment that we would experience if the economy was in the long run equilibrium. In other words, this unemployment is not equal to the full employment level. Unemployment is relatively high here. So what we observe though with the inflation rate, about 2%, well, inflation is relatively low. So what this can tell us with relatively high unemployment and low inflation, well, we see that perhaps the government or the economy is in a recession. Let's see what that looks like in our model. Well, as you can see, this point right here, which we'll call E, would be our long-run equilibrium. At a point such as A, we observe that output, YA, is less than the natural rate of output. So we're producing goods and services at a rate that's below the natural rate of unemployment. So what we see is that this shows we have higher unemployment, as we had just mentioned, of about 20%. But the price level is relatively low. So we can see that the economy is in a recession. So we're producing below the full employment level. So what can we do? Well, the government might be interested in trying to curb the effects of this recession and therefore increase the aggregate demand. What can it do? Well, to start off with, the best policies would be to enact policies that would boost growth in unemployment and therefore increase the aggregate demand. So the first thing that we know is that we can enact expansionary monetary policy. What we observe with this is that the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, causing a decrease in the interest rate, causing an increase in investment spending, which therefore causes aggregate demand to increase. So with expansionary monetary policy, this would push the aggregate demand curve up and to the right, closer to the long-run equilibrium that we're trying to get back to. On the other hand, we can also enact expansionary fiscal policy. From this perspective, the government can increase government spending, or it can cut taxes to stimulate consumption. Both effects would cause an increase in the aggregate demand. So what we observe here is that if our economy is starting off in a recession, and we see that this recession is coming from a demand-side shock because aggregate demand is lower than in the long-run equilibrium, indicated by the higher unemployment rate and the relatively lower inflation rate, we see that the best thing for the government to do is to enact expansionary policies, either through expansionary monetary policy by the Federal Reserve, or through expansionary fiscal policy by Congress and the federal government. Now, let's consider another example. Let's consider an economy that's at full employment, which means that it's in the long-run equilibrium. Let's say that we have two policies that are being enacted. First, the central bank has decided to increase interest rates, which means that we have contractionary monetary policy. On the other hand, during that same time, Congress decides to increase spending on new military equipment. So we want to know what happens with the economy. Let's take a look. Well, as we just noted, we start off in the long-run equilibrium at point A, with PA being our equilibrium price level, and we're producing at the natural rate of output, so we're at full employment. The economy starts off in the long-run equilibrium, and we have two effects, right? We know that we have contractionary monetary policy, and we have expansionary fiscal policy. So what happens? Let's start off first with contractionary monetary policy. So when the Federal Reserve is engaging in contractionary monetary policy, the money supply decreases, leading to an increase in interest rates, leading to a fall in investment spending, leading to a fall in aggregate demand. So as we can see here, aggregate demand decreases. So we move from the long-run equilibrium at point A to a short-run equilibrium at point B, with a lower price level, therefore lower inflation, but also lower production, which means that unemployment has risen because of this policy. So the cost of trying to curb inflation is going to be that unemployment increases. We have lower growth in the economy as the Federal Reserve tries to curb inflation and increase interest rates, and the price level falls. What we observe, and we've noted before, is that the more responsive investment spending is to changes in interest rates, the larger the impact of this monetary policy on aggregate demand. Now, let's consider what happens with fiscal policy. So we know that when the government is increasing government spending, that's going to impact the aggregate demand curve. In this scenario, we see expansionary fiscal policy. So we have an increase in government spending because they're spending on new military equipment. Expansionary fiscal policy could also come from cutting taxes, which would stimulate consumption spending. Now, if the government is spending more on military equipment, all else equal, that is going to lead to an increase in the aggregate demand. So, what we observe then is a shift out or to the right of the aggregate demand. We're moving from the long-run equilibrium point at point A to a new short-run equilibrium point at point C. We observe that prices have risen, so the result of this policy is an increase in inflation, but we're also producing more. So we see that unemployment has fallen because of the expansionary fiscal policy. Now, what we know from our previous videos in this segment of the course is that the impact of government spending on the aggregate economy also depends on the size of the multiplier effect and the size of the crowding out effect. So, if the multiplier effect is very large in the economy, meaning that people spend most of their income and don't save a lot of their income, there's going to be an even larger impact from the change in government spending on aggregate demand. Because as the government increases its spending on new military equipment, it's going to have that trickle-down effect throughout the economy and also, to some degree, boost consumption as well. So the impact on aggregate demand is going to be greater than simply the shift in government or the increase in government spending. So what do we observe from this expansionary fiscal policy? Well, unemployment falls, but it comes at the cost of higher inflation. What we observe if these two policies happen simultaneously is that we have contradictory effects of government policy. So which effect is going to dominate? That's going to depend on which one of them is stronger. So is the change in interest rates coming from monetary policy influencing investment spending greater than the impact of the change in government spending and its influence on the aggregate demand? So it depends on the scenario and it depends on the economy. In this scenario, if we have contractionary monetary policy but expansionary fiscal policy, we don't really know what the influence will be on the economy. It's going to depend on which effect is stronger. Now, what are some possible scenarios of this happening? Well, if Congress decides to pass a stimulus package, but the Fed is concerned about the impact that it would have on inflation. So if Congress decides to invest in an infrastructure project, or if it decides to expand spending on new military equipment, or expand spending on education, all of these things would stimulate growth in the economy through the increase in government spending, causing a shift out of the aggregate demand. Now, if the Federal Reserve observes this and sees that there's high inflation as a result of this policy, it may intervene in the economy with contractionary monetary policy to try to soften that growth in the sense of trying to curb the effects on inflation. Okay, so what happens if we have shocks in the economy and we want to get back to the long-run equilibrium? So we want to know if we have demand-side shocks or if we have supply side shocks, how do we get back to the long run equilibrium if the government doesn't intervene? So if we have a negative demand side shock or a negative supply side shock, and the government enacts stabilizing policies, it's going to try to shift the aggregate demand curve in a way that brings the economy back closer to the long run equilibrium. But what if they don't intervene? What if there are no stimulating policies that are put into place to try to stabilize the economy? Well, let's take a look what would happen in the long run. So when there are short run shocks, if the government does not enact policies to stabilize, eventually we're going to return back to the long run equilibrium. What happens on the demand side? Well, initially, businesses do not expect the change in the price level. Once they factor in the new price level into their business decisions and wages and prices are not sticky, the short run aggregate supply curve will adjust. So what we see here is that the expectations of the price level and expectations of inflation are a critical component in our economy to get us back to the long run equilibrium. So let's take a look. Here we have a demand side shock. We're moving from the long run equilibrium to the short run equilibrium. When businesses make their decisions, they anticipate or expect the price level to be at PA. In the short run, though, after the demand side shock, they observe that the actual price level, PB, is lower than the expected price level. So, since we have sticky wages and sticky prices in the economy, what we observe then is that we have an adjustment in the short run aggregate supply as a movement along the short run aggregate supply, or an adjustment in production by the firms to YB. Now, in the long run, what happens is that eventually businesses expect the price level to be lower at PB. So they set their expectations, they adjust wages and prices once they are able to do so in the long run to reflect this new lower price level. By doing so, that would cause a shift in the short run aggregate supply curve over time. So in the long run, we see that when we have a change in expectations of the price level by businesses, they can adjust the short run aggregate supply curve. That brings us back to the long run equilibrium, yet at a lower price level. So we see that expectations of businesses are the key component that bring us back to the long run equilibrium after a demand side shock. Now, what about the supply side? Well, short run supply side shocks, or changes in the short run aggregate supply curve, are going to be based on a temporary resource shock. So therefore, eventually, we'll return back to the long run equilibrium levels. So remember that our short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift if we have a change in resources or technology in the short run as well as in the long run, or if we have changes in expectations, as we have just seen in the demand side example. So if there's a short run supply shock, what we observe if there's a change temporarily in resources or a change temporarily in production technology, the temporary part tells us, well, eventually that's going to go away. And if that part goes away without any government intervention, then the short run aggregate supply curve moves back to where it originally was. Now, what about permanent changes in resources or technology? Well, if there's permanent changes in resources or technology, we see a change in both the short run aggregate supply curve and the long run aggregate supply curve. So both curves are shifting, and therefore we have a new long run equilibrium. So let's look at what we have here. So first, if we have a supply side shock, and in this case, let's say we have the price of oil has decreased, right? Oil is a resource that's used in the production of many goods and services, and many businesses are reliant on that. So this is a positive supply shock. So we're producing more, and the price level has fallen, okay? If this is temporary, and there's a temporary boom in oil production, Eventually, the temporary part tells us that we have to go back to the original level. So we're going to go back to the original level of oil production, or the original price of oil, because we assume that this is a temporary shock. So once that adjustment occurs, then we see that the short-run aggregate supply curve simply shifts back to the long-run equilibrium. Now, on the other hand, if the shock was permanent, and there's a permanently higher production in oil, for example, then if it's a permanent change, we have a change in the short-run aggregate supply and a change in the long-run aggregate supply. So if the supply shock is a result of a permanent adjustment in resources, then the short-run aggregate supply curve changes and the long-run aggregate supply curve changes. So what we observe then with a permanent resource change is long-run and short-run aggregate supply curve change. So we permanently have a new long-run equilibrium. So what have we focused on in this segment of the course? Well, the goal of this video has been to give you a little bit more practice of how the government can intervene to stabilize the economy after demand-side or supply-side shocks. We also focused on discussing how we get back to the long-run equilibrium after there's been a shock in the economy. We see that with demand-side shocks, if there's no government intervention through monetary or fiscal policy, eventually there's an adjustment in expectations by businesses, and they adjust their wages and prices in such a way that would cause a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve to reflect the new expected price level. That would cause the economy to move back to the long-run equilibrium. On the supply side shock, it depends on whether we're talking about a permanent or temporary shock in resources or technology. If it's temporary, then eventually, once that temporary shock goes away, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts back to its original point. But if it's a permanent change in resources or technology, then we have a shift in both the short-run and long-run aggregate supply curve, and that leads to a new long-run equilibrium. It's a good idea to go through and pause these videos and try to go through the practice questions yourselves and try to explain it to yourself. It's a great way to practice going through the graphs and explaining the analytical parts associated with monetary and fiscal policy and those impacts on the aggregate economy. Of course, it's a great idea to also go through the practice exercises associated with this part of the course. Thanks so much for joining me.